They said Snowhaven was a forgotten town buried under endless snow. But when a weary soldier and his loyal dog wandered in one winter night, everything began to change. What started as a search for shelter became a story of faith, kindness, and a miracle that would bring a whole community back to life. Would you have stayed to protect a stranger's dream the way he did? Or would you have walked away, not knowing that God was about to work through your hands? Now sit back, relax, and let your heart follow the light that never fades in the snow. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The wind carried sharp flakes that danced under the gray light of dusk, and the forest of North Haven stood frozen in silence. Snow fell thick over the pine branches, the road buried under a white, endless sheet, and the world seemed paused between breath and stillness. Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck as the tires spun uselessly in the deep snow. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, tall, but slightly stooped from years of carrying heavy packs. His hair was hazel brown with strands of early gray that framed a face carved by wind and time. The stubble on his jaw was rough, the kind that came from days without mirrors or comfort. His eyes, a pale steel blue, watched the road ahead with the quiet patience of a man who had seen worse than weather. Once, a soldier, Ethan had returned from distant wars to find himself a stranger in his own country. Cities moved faster than his heart could follow. Factories closed. Promises faded. He worked wherever hands were needed, fixing fences, shoveling snow, carrying bricks. Yet inside, the discipline of a soldier still lived steady and proud, though loneliness sat beside it like a silent comrade. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd, with thick black and tan fur dusted by snow. His amber eyes were alert and full of intelligence, his body lean and strong, like a creature born to endure. Ranger had followed Ethan since deployment days, trained to guard and sense danger. Now he guarded only one thing: the man who had saved him long ago from the ruins of a collapsed outpost. Between them existed a bond without words, a language of looks and breaths. When the truck engine coughed and died, Ethan tried twice more to start it, but the machine only groaned. The fuel gauge lay nearly empty, the cold biting through the metal. He leaned back, feeling the sting of helplessness rise, but only for a moment. A soldier did not surrender to weather. He turned to Ranger and said softly, almost to himself, "We walk." Ranger gave a small whine, but obeyed, jumping down into the snow, leaving paw prints that filled quickly with white. The wind howled through the trees as they trudged forward, Ethan's boots sinking deep into the drift. The night air was sharp enough to burn his lungs. He kept one hand on his worn canvas bag. Inside were his papers, a wrench, and a single photograph of a younger man in uniform with a dog by his side. His steps were heavy but rhythmic, each one a small act of persistence. Time blurred in the whiteness. The forest grew denser, its shadows stretching like dark ribbons against the snow. The cold pressed into his bones, but what hurt more was the silence, that long, unbroken quiet, where only the wind spoke. Ranger stopped. Suddenly, ears pointed forward, nose lifted. Through the storm's veil, a faint yellow light flickered between the trees. Hope stirred, fragile but real. They followed it, moving toward the glow, until the outline of a small wooden house appeared. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of snow smoke, rose weakly from a crooked chimney, and one window spilled warm light into the storm. Ethan hesitated at the gate, unsure if anyone would open their door to a stranger. His breath came in slow clouds. Ranger looked up at him as if to say this was their chance. Ethan stepped forward and knocked. For a moment, there was no answer, only the sound of wind scraping against the walls. Then a slow shuffle of footsteps came from within, and the door creaked open. A woman stood framed in the glow of a kerosene lamp. She was small and thin, her back slightly bent, the skin of her face lined like a map of years. But her eyes were startlingly bright pale blue and sharp alive with both caution and kindness. Her hair, once golden, was now silver white and braided loosely over one shoulder. She wore a long wool cardigan that looked older than she was, its edges frayed but clean. Ethan removed his cap and lowered his head slightly, a soldier's reflex. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my truck broke down on the road. We're just looking for a place to wait out the storm." The woman studied him in silence, her gaze steady but not cold. Her voice when it came was soft but firm. "Come in before you both freeze to death." The warmth of the small house hit him like sunlight. The air smelled of cedar and old books of tea leaves and ash. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he entered. A pot sat on the iron stove steam, whispering from its lid. Ranger shook the snow from his coat, sending white flakes across the rug. The woman smiled faintly at him. "What a fine shepherd you have reminds me of my husband's dog long ago always thought he owned the house." Ethan gave a tired nod, the corner of his mouth lifting. Ranger tends to think the same. The woman chuckled her laugh like the rustle of dry leaves. She motioned toward a chair near the fire. "Sit, soldier, you have the look of one who has been walking too long." Ethan froze slightly at the word soldier. He had not told her that. Perhaps it was the posture or the distant look in his eyes. He sat down carefully, feeling the chair creak beneath his weight. The fire painted his face in shades of orange and gold. The woman poured tea into two mismatched cups and placed one in front of him. The steam rose soft and sweet, mingling with the faint tremor in his hands. "I'm Margaret Hale," she said, simply settling into her rocking chair, 96 years, and still making tea when I shouldn't. Ethan looked up. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale. I'm Ethan. This is Ranger." The dog lifted his head at his name, then curled up near the fire with a deep sigh. Margaret watched them both, her expression softening. She asked where he came from, and he spoke little but honest about working odd jobs, about leaving the noise of cities behind, about nights spent sleeping in his truck under bridges. He avoided speaking of the war, but his silence told enough. Margaret listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She said the world had grown louder and lonelier since her husband passed, that sometimes the radio spoke more kindly than people. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows, but inside, time seemed to settle. The warmth, the tea, the soft breathing of Ranger filled the room with a kind of peace that Ethan had forgotten existed. When the clock struck midnight, Margaret stood and adjusted the lamp. "You'll stay in the back room tonight," she said. "The storm will not rest till morning." Ethan started to protest, but she raised a frail hand. "A home unused is colder than the snow outside. It needs footsteps again." He nodded quietly. "Thank you, ma'am." Ranger followed him to the small room at the end of the hall. The bed was narrow but clean, the air faintly scented with lavender and old linen. Ethan sat on the edge, rubbing his palms together. Through the window, he saw the snow still falling thick and endless, covering the world in silence. For the first time in months, he felt the weight in his chest ease, if only slightly. He looked down at Ranger, who had already settled at the foot of the bed tail curled around his paws. eyes half closed, but watchful. Ethan whispered, "We made it another night, buddy." The dog's ear twitched as if in agreement. Beyond the walls, the storm raged on, but inside that small house, warmth and breath lingered like a fragile promise waiting for dawn. The morning light was pale and cold as it broke through the heavy clouds over North Haven. Snow still drifted gently through the pine trees, falling in soft layers across the yard and piling against the wooden fence. The air smelled faintly of ash and frozen earth. Inside the old house, warmth lingered from the night before, though the fire had burned low and the windows carried a thin glaze of frost. Ethan Cole awoke to the soft creak of the timbers and the steady breathing of Ranger curled near the door. He sat up slowly, his back stiff from the narrow bed. The room was small, but it felt safe. For the first time in months, he had slept through the night without waking to the sound of wind or the ache of loneliness. He rubbed his hands together to bring life back into them, then looked down at Ranger, who was already stretching tail, wagging faintly as if to remind him that another day had begun. Ethan stepped quietly into the main room, careful not to disturb the silence. The old clock on the mantel ticked in its steady rhythm. Mrs. Margaret Hale was already awake. She stood near the stove, wrapped in a shawl, the color of old parchment, her thin frame outlined by the faint glow of the coals. Her hair was braided neatly, and her movements were slow, but certain, each gesture marked by the discipline of long habit. She had lived a lifetime of winters, and it showed not only in the lines of her face, but in the quiet endurance that seemed to surround her like air. Ethan noticed her hands, thin and veined, but steady as they lifted the kettle from the stove. He realized she was used to mornings like this alone, with only the fire for company. She turned when she heard his boots on the floorboards and smiled gently. "Morning, soldier." The words still carried a strange weight in his chest, but her tone made it softer, almost kind. "Morning, ma'am. I didn't mean to oversleep." She waved her hand. "You needed the rest. No man can fight the cold without it." She poured him a cup of tea, the steam curling upward, like the breath of the house itself. He nodded in thanks, took the cup, and sat near the table. The wood was scratched and scarred from years of use, yet it felt sturdy like everything else in this place. As he sipped the tea, Margaret's gaze moved toward the window. "The roof is sagging," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Snow's been too heavy this week." Ethan followed her eyes to the corner, where the rafters bowed slightly under the weight. He stood at once, setting the cup down. "I can fix it." Margaret blinked, surprised. "You know roofing." "I know a bit of everything," he said with a faint smile. "Soldiers learn to build when there's nothing left standing." She hesitated, then nodded. "Tools are in the shed, but mind the steps, they're icy." Ethan pulled on his jacket and gloves. Ranger followed close behind his breath, forming small clouds in the frigid air. The yard was buried knee-deep in snow. The shed leaned slightly to one side, but still held strong. Inside, he found an old ladder, a hammer, and a rusted shovel. He tested the rungs before climbing the wood, groaning under his weight. Ranger sat at the base of the ladder, watching intently, ears twitching. As Ethan began clearing the snow from the roof, flakes clung to his hair and beard, melting into cold streaks on his cheeks. His muscles burned from the effort, but he welcomed the ache. It reminded him he was still useful, still capable of mending something. For so long he had drifted from town to town doing odd jobs, but never belonging. Here in this small yard, with the old house creaking beneath him, he felt for the first time that his work mattered to someone. Margaret watched from below her shawl, pulled tight her breath, rising in small clouds. When he finished, Ethan climbed down his hands raw from the cold. He turned to her. The roof should hold now, but that window frame needs sealing. I'll take care of that next. She nodded slowly, the lines of her face softening into a faint smile. You've done more before breakfast than I've managed in a month. Come in before the wind steals your bones. Inside the house, the fire had been rekindled. Margaret handed him a towel and poured another cup of tea. Ranger settled near the hearth tail, sweeping lightly against the rug. The dog looked completely at ease, as though he had always belonged there. Margaret reached down to pat his head, her wrinkled hand resting on his thick fur. You've got a good heart, she murmured. So does your master, I think. Ethan looked at her, unsure how to answer. He was not used to kindness that expected nothing in return. He nodded slightly, focusing on the warmth of the tea between his palms. The day stretched on in a quiet rhythm. Ethan repaired the loose latch on the back door, sealed the window with cloth and tar, and stacked the remaining firewood beside the stove. The work kept his mind steady. Margaret busied herself with small tasks around the kitchen, humming softly, a tune that sounded like something from another time. By afternoon, the snow had thickened again, falling in wide, lazy flakes that muffled every sound. The world outside seemed far away. As the light dimmed, Ethan finished his chores and stood at the doorway looking out into the white silence. The horizon was gone, swallowed by snow. Margaret joined him, holding a small mug between her hands. She spoke quietly. My husband built this house after the war, she said. He came back with bad lungs and a quiet heart, but he wanted a place that could hold the sound of laughter again. We never had children, but this house became our memory of what family might have been. Ethan listened to the words, settling heavily in him. He understood the ache behind them. He too had returned from war, with something missing, something the world could not give back. Margaret smiled faintly, though her eyes shone with distant sorrow. If he were still here, she said softly, he would have liked you. You remind me of him in the way you work, without complaint. Ethan lowered his gaze, feeling a tightness in his throat. He had not been compared to anyone in years. Thank you, ma'am, he said quietly. She nodded as if it were settled. You can stay through the winter if you like. The storms are harsh, and I could use someone to keep the roof over my head. Ethan hesitated. Instinct told him not to rely on anything that could be taken away. But as he looked around at the warm glow of the fire and the steady rise of Ranger's breathing near the hearth, he realized this offer was not charity, but trust. He met her gaze and nodded once. I'll stay as long as you need me. Margaret smiled, then turned back to her chair by the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake catching the faint orange light from the window, before vanishing into the dark. Ethan sat quietly for a long while, listening to the wind and the soft creak of the rocking chair. Something inside him began to thaw, slow and uncertain, but real. The loneliness that had followed him from battlefield to roadside began to loosen its hold. When the clock struck 9, Margaret rose to add another log to the fire. The flames flared briefly, painting her face in warm light. She looked at him and said in her calm voice, I believe houses remember kindness. When you fix them, they give it back. Ethan nodded. Maybe people do too. Ranger lifted his head and gave a low, contented sound before resting again. The room fell into peaceful silence. Ethan's eyes wandered to the small photograph on the mantel, a young couple standing in front of this very house decades ago, snow falling gently around them. For a brief moment, he could almost imagine that time had folded, and he was part of that picture too, standing in a place where loss and warmth coexisted. The fire cracked softly. Margaret's breathing slowed as she drifted toward sleep in her chair. Ethan Rose quietly covered her with a wool blanket and looked once more through the frosted window. The snow had buried the road completely, but for the first time in many winters, he did not feel lost. The storm outside belonged to the world, but inside these walls, there was still a measure of peace waiting for whoever had the patience to stay. The night had settled cold and heavy over North Haven. The wind moved through the pines like a restless sea, carrying with it the low moan of winter against every shutter and eave. Inside the old house, the fire had dimmed to quiet embers, throwing soft orange light across the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin. Ethan Cole sat at the small table by the kitchen window, mending a torn sleeve with a needle and thread borrowed from Margaret. His movements were slow but steady. Work like this kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. Ranger lay curled on the rug near the door, his chest rising and falling in calm rhythm, ears twitching every time the wind rattled the walls. Ethan had grown used to the sounds of the old house, to its creaks and sighs, but tonight something in the air felt different, as though the storm carried a whisper not meant to be heard. He put down the cloth and listened. Beyond the glass, snow was drifting sideways, the world a blur of white. The wind slipped through the cracks of the window frame, making the flame in the lamp shiver. Ranger lifted his head and gave a low growl deep in his throat, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. Ethan frowned. "Easy, boy, it's just the wind." But the dog stood muscles tense, nose twitching. He moved toward the kitchen, sniffing near the floorboards by the old stove. Ethan followed his boots, making soft thuds on the worn planks. Ranger scratched at a particular spot on the floor, where one board sounded hollow under his weight. Ethan knelt down and tapped it. The sound that came back was not the solid thud of oak, but a dull echo, the sound of emptiness beneath. His fingers searched the edge of the plank until he found a small gap. He worked his knife into it and pried it loose. The wood came up slowly, groaning like something awakened after long sleep. Beneath the plank was a shallow cavity lined with dust and the faint smell of iron. Inside lay a small tin box, wrapped in old waxed cloth, the kind used decades ago to protect papers from damp air. Ethan stared for a moment, the box resting in his hands, cold and heavier than it looked. He carried it to the table, brushed off the dust, and unfolded the fabric carefully. The tin creaked open with resistance as if it had not been touched in years. Inside lay two objects, a folded map, yellowed with age, and a letter sealed with a brittle thread. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, yet shaky, the ink faded to brown. He broke the seal gently and unfolded the paper. The letter was written in long, elegant strokes, though the hand trembled in places. It read, "Hale Land Trust, year 1941, and beneath it a single line written with uneven force, 'When the wind changes, stay.'" Ethan read it twice, the meaning just out of reach. He spread the map open on the table. It showed the outline of North Haven as it might have been 80 years ago, the lake broader, the forest thicker, and several plots marked with initials E.H. and C.H. near the edge of the property where the house now stood. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and salt, perhaps from candles or damp air long ago. He traced the lines with his finger, noticing a small red mark near the river labeled Beacon Point. The name stirred something in him, though he could not say why. Ranger sat beside him, head tilted, as if reading the letter too. The wind outside grew louder, pushing against the windows until they rattled. The flame in the lamp flickered, casting moving shadows across the walls. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the letter still in his hand. His mind turned over the words again and again. When the wind changes, stay. They felt like a warning and a promise at once. He thought of Margaret, of the way her eyes sometimes grew distant when she spoke of her husband. He remembered the photograph on the mantel, the young man standing tall beside her in front of the same house. Perhaps he had written this letter. Perhaps he had hidden it. The thought made the room feel smaller, filled with echoes of people who had once walked these floors and built this shelter with their own hands. Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in the box. He could ask Margaret in the morning, though a part of him hesitated. There was a tenderness in her silence that he did not want to disturb. Some memories, he knew, were like snow. If touched too quickly, they crumbled into pieces. He closed the tin box and set it on the counter. The wind howled again through the chimney, making the fire jump. Ranger moved closer to the hearth, eyes still on the dark corner where the board had been lifted. Ethan replaced the plank, carefully pressing it back into place until it sat flush with the rest of the floor. He washed his hands, the water icy in the basin, then returned to his seat. The letter's words lingered in his mind as he stared into the dying fire. The world outside was hidden beneath a curtain of snow, but inside the house he felt the weight of unseen years pressing gently around him. He wondered what this land trust was and why it mattered enough for someone to hide it. He thought of soldiers who came home and built things that could outlast their pain, and he wondered if this house was one of those things. He remembered Margaret's voice that afternoon, when she said her husband built the place after the war to keep the sound of laughter inside its walls. He looked up toward the ceiling, hearing the wind slide through the rafters like a whisper of breath. The letter's message returned to him again. When the wind changes, stay. The phrase made his chest tighten. Maybe it was not just for whoever found it, but for anyone who carried the weight of wandering. The fire hissed softly. He reached down and stroked Ranger's head, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingers. "You did well tonight," he murmured. The dog leaned against his leg, eyes half closed, but still alert. The lamp flickered again, and for a moment Ethan thought he heard something beyond the storm, a low, rhythmic sound like the beating of a distant engine or the echo of waves against stone. It passed as quickly as it came, leaving only silence. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had thickened the trees, bending under its weight. He could see nothing beyond the yard, only the endless white swirling under the moonlight. Yet as he watched, the wind shifted direction, sweeping across the forest with a new tone, almost a sigh. The change was small, barely noticeable, but it stirred the curtain and made the candle flame steady once more. Ethan stood motionless, the letter's words echoing softly in his mind. When the wind changes, stay. He did not know what it meant, but something deep inside him felt that the message was not finished, that the storm itself carried pieces of a story waiting to be uncovered. He turned away from the window, placed another log on the fire, and sat beside Ranger until the warmth filled the room again. The night stretched long and quiet. The house groaned softly in the cold, but to Ethan, it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded alive. The morning came quietly to North Haven, with snow still drifting from the gray sky, and the world wrapped in a soft, endless white. The air was sharp, but still, and from the chimney of Margaret Hale's house, a thin ribbon of smoke rose into the pale light. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread slowly across the wooden floor, the scent of burning pine filling the air. Ethan Cole sat near the window, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the snow fall in steady silence. Ranger dozed beside the hearth, his tail curled around his body, ears twitching now and then, as if he were still listening to the echoes of the night before. The tin box and its hidden letter had kept Ethan awake long after the fire had burned low. The words, "When the wind changes, stay still," turned in his mind like a quiet song. Margaret entered the room with a folded blanket in her arms. Her movements were slow, but deliberate, her thin figure straight despite her age. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, and her blue eyes carried a brightness that made her seem younger than her years. She placed the blanket over the back of a chair and smiled at Ethan. "You were up early again." He nodded. "Couldn't sleep much. Too many thoughts." She looked at him for a moment, as though she already understood what he meant. Then she sat down across from him and folded her hands. "My husband used to be like that. His mind never rested, especially in winter, when the storms made him think the world might stop if he did not keep working." Ethan looked up. "You told me he built this place after the war." She nodded slowly. "His name was Thomas Hale. He came home from the Navy with bad lungs and quiet eyes, but he still wanted to give something back to the town. So he built a small radio station behind this house, a wooden shed with an antenna that barely reached the treetops. He called it the Snow Haven Beacon. It was not much, just a way to send weather reports and fishing updates to farmers and sailors around the lake. But for a long time, it kept this town alive during hard winters." Ethan listened, his attention fixed on her voice. She continued softly. "After he passed away, the beacon went silent. I couldn't bring myself to go out there again. Every time the wind carried the old static, I felt as though he were still speaking from somewhere just beyond the snow." She smiled faintly, then shook her head. "But now that you're here, perhaps the house is ready for another voice." Ethan felt something shift inside him. He had spent years building and repairing things for strangers, never staying long enough to see what came of his work. But here, the thought of restoring something that had once carried hope stirred him in a way he hadn't felt since leaving the army. "Where's the station now?" he asked. Margaret pointed through the window. "Behind the pine grove, there's a shed with a metal roof. If the snow hasn't buried it by now, it should still be standing." He put on his coat and gloves and stepped outside with Ranger trotting beside him. The wind had calmed, but the cold bit through his sleeves. They crossed the yard, their boots sinking into the snow until they reached the grove. Half hidden behind the trees was a narrow structure of gray wood and rusted tin. The antenna above it leaned slightly to one side, its wire coiled like an old scar against the roof. Ethan pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, and a cloud of cold air rolled out carrying the scent of dust and old paper. Inside the space was small, no larger than a storage room, but everything was still there. The desk with its cracked leather chair, a stack of empty coffee tins, and a console lined with dials and gauges dulled by time. The radio transmitter sat in the center, silent and covered in frost. He brushed the snow from its surface and examined the wiring. Most of the cables were intact, though the insulation had hardened. A few hours of work and some patience might be enough to bring it back to life. Ranger sniffed along the edges of the room, tail wagging softly, as though approving the task. Ethan rolled up his sleeves and began cleaning. He used a rag and small brush to clear the dust-tightening screws, replacing brittle wires with new ones from his repair kit. The work came naturally to him, hands steady and sure, the same way they had been when repairing engines in the field. But this was different. Every sound of turning metal or connecting wire felt personal, as if each small fix was a way of speaking to the ghosts that lingered in the room. The static memory of Margaret's husband lingered in the air, and Ethan worked carefully, as though he might wake it too suddenly. By late afternoon, the light through the small window turned golden and dim. The wind had picked up again, swirling snow past the glass. Ethan tightened one last screw, wiped his hands, and flipped the main switch. At first, there was only silence. Then a faint hum filled the air, followed by the soft crackle of static. The sound was fragile but alive. He adjusted the frequency knob slowly until the noise steadied into a low rhythmic tone. The old speaker buzzed and then settled. He smiled for the first time that day. Ranger barked once as if answering the signal. Ethan turned toward the door. Margaret stood in the doorway, wrapped in her heavy shawl, the lantern light behind her making her appear almost translucent against the snow. Her expression was one of disbelief, and something deeper, a quiet gratitude that reached her eyes. "You did it," she said softly. He nodded. "It's breathing again." She stepped closer, resting one frail hand on the edge of the console. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the metal. "My husband used to say the beacon was not just about weather or news. He believed voices carried warmth through cold nights. That sometimes people just needed to know someone was still awake out there." Ethan said nothing, but he understood perfectly. They spent the next hour listening to the quiet hum of the machine, the only sound between them, the faint rhythm of time returning to the room. As night fell, the storm outside deepened once more. Snow whipped against the windows, and the trees creaked under its weight. Ethan lit the lantern, casting a warm circle of light across the small station. Ranger settled under the table ears, alert, his amber eyes glowing softly in the dimness. Margaret sat by the console, her posture straight, though her body was frail. "You've given me back something I thought was lost," she said. Ethan looked at her, unsure how to answer. "I only fixed what was already there," he said quietly. She smiled. "That's what most miracles are," she replied simply. "Things repaired at the right time." The transmitter buzzed softly, its signal spreading out across the frozen hills. Ethan adjusted the mic switch and leaned closer. For a moment he hesitated, then spoke in a calm, steady voice that filled the room. "Snowhaven Beacon, reporting clear skies over North Haven, steady winds from the west, and a long winter ahead. To anyone listening, stay warm and keep your lights on." He released the button. The static faded and returned like a slow heartbeat. Margaret closed her eyes and let out a breath that sounded like relief. For the first time in 30 years, her husband's beacon was alive again, carrying its faint signal through the snow. The sound of it filled the house later that night, soft and persistent, like a memory refusing to fade. Ethan sat near the old transmitter, his hands still resting on the dials, while Ranger slept beneath the table. The dog's ears twitched each time the radio crackled, as though he too could hear the echoes of the past returning. When Margaret rose to leave, she paused at the door. There was peace in her face, and her voice was quiet but sure. "Thank you, Ethan. You've done more for this house than you know." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Maybe it's the house doing something for me." She smiled and closed the door behind her, leaving him alone with the sound of the beacon. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and through the static of the old radio came the soft whisper of wind moving across the frozen land. The storm began before dawn. The air outside was heavy with snow, and the wind howled through the pines like the cry of something ancient. North Haven lay buried under a white shroud that swallowed every sound. The drifts rose higher than the fences, and the sky was the color of steel. From inside the old Hale house, Ethan Cole could hear the windows tremble under each gust. The world had vanished beyond the glass, replaced by a storm that moved with the slow power of the sea. Ethan stood near the table, adjusting the dials on the radio transmitter he had repaired days earlier. The small machine buzzed weakly, its light flickering as the power strained against the cold. When the town's power lines went down an hour ago, he had switched to the backup generator in the shed. It coughed and rattled, but it worked. Across the room, Margaret sat wrapped in her thick wool blanket near the fire, her face lit by the orange glow. Her hands were folded around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, yet she didn't seem to mind. She watched Ethan move with quiet confidence, her eyes carrying the kind of trust that came from knowing she was no longer alone in the storm. Ranger lay close to the door, head resting on his paws, fur dusted with bits of ash that had drifted from the hearth. His ears twitched at every gust of wind. The dog was restless, sensing the unease in the air. Ethan glanced at him before leaning toward the microphone. His voice came steady and low through the crackle of static. Snow Haven beacon to anyone listening. The storm over North Haven is growing stronger. Stay inside and keep your fires burning. Do not travel on the roads. Visibility is 0. Repeat, do not travel. The words faded into static and returned faintly through the feedback, echoing his warning. When he turned off the mic, the silence returned thicker than before. He looked toward Margaret, who nodded slowly. "You sound just like him," she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Just trying to keep the light on, ma'am." Hours passed. The storm deepened until even the sound of the wind became a constant roar. The house creaked under the weight of snow pressing down on the roof. Ethan moved through the rooms, checking the windows, sealing the gaps with rags and old blankets. The temperature had dropped sharply, his breath visible even inside. Ranger followed him from room to room, paws soundless on the wooden floor. The dog's amber eyes never left his owner's face, watching for cues, waiting for a command. By nightfall, the generator's hum was the only steady sound left. Margaret had fallen asleep in her chair, her head tilted slightly, the firelight flickering across her silver hair. Ethan sat near the radio again, turning the dials to scan for any returning signals. Nothing but static. He rubbed his eyes and leaned back, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. That was when Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The movement was sharp and silent. His ears stood straight, nose twitching. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan froze. "What is it, boy?" Ranger stood up, tail stiff, and padded toward the door. He pressed his nose against the bottom gap and whined softly. Then he barked once quick and urgent before looking back at Ethan. Ethan rose, grabbing his heavy coat and flashlight. The air outside the door hit him like ice. Snow fell thick and fast, nearly blinding him as he stepped into the storm. Ranger bounded ahead, moving through the drifts, with ease, his dark fur blending with the shadows. Ethan followed, his boots sinking deep. The beam of his flashlight cut through the white haze, revealing only swirling flakes and trees bowing under the wind. He called out, but the storm swallowed his voice. Still, Ranger pressed forward, nose close to the ground. Then the dog stopped near the edge of the forest and barked again. Ethan moved closer, the light of his torch landing on a small shape half buried in snow. His heart lurched. It was a child. He dropped to his knees, brushing the snow away from the boy's face. The skin was pale, lips blue from the cold. He looked to be no older than 10, wrapped in a thick red parka that was soaked through. Ethan touched the side of his neck. There was a pulse, faint but present. He lifted the boy, carefully wrapping his coat around him and shouting for Ranger. The dog stayed close, pressing against Ethan's leg as they struggled back toward the house. When they reached the porch, Ethan kicked the door open with his boot. The rush of warm air met the frozen night. Margaret woke with a start, her eyes widening as she saw the boy in Ethan's arms. "Dear Lord," she whispered, rising unsteadily to her feet. Ethan laid the child near the hearth, stripping off the wet parka and boots. He rubbed the boy's arms and chest, trying to bring warmth back to his body. Ranger lay down beside them, his body heat adding to the warmth. Margaret hurried to fetch more blankets, her thin hands trembling as she worked. They wrapped the child in layers of wool until his shivering began to slow. After some time, color started to return to his cheeks. Ethan fed the fire with another log and sat back, breathing hard. He glanced at Margaret, who was kneeling beside the boy, gently brushing the wet hair from his forehead. "He'll make it," Ethan said quietly. She nodded, relief softening the worry in her face. They stayed near the hearth through the night, taking turns tending the fire. Outside, the storm continued its relentless howl, but inside, there was only the crackle of flames and the steady breathing of the boy. Ranger stayed awake, eyes fixed on the door, as if guarding them all. When dawn finally came, the storm had eased. A pale gray light filled the room. The boy stirred his eyelids, fluttering before opening slowly. He blinked at the unfamiliar faces. "You're safe now," Ethan said softly. The boy tried to sit up, but winced at the cold in his bones. Margaret handed him a cup of warm water. "Drink this, dear. You were out there all night." The boy took a small sip and looked around. "My name's Leo," he said weakly. "Leo King." Ethan and Margaret exchanged a quick glance. The name struck a note of recognition. King. Ethan spoke gently. "Who were you with, Leo?" The boy hesitated, eyes downcast. "My grandfather, Charles King. He's building something near the lake. But I went out with my sled and got lost when the snow came. I tried to find the road back, but I couldn't." His voice broke the memory of fear, still raw. Ethan leaned back, the name echoing in his mind. He had seen that name before on construction signs near the forest edge months ago, the logo of King Development, promising a new resort and private cabins. He looked at the boy again, seeing not the name, but the child shivering under the blanket. None of that mattered now. "You're safe here," Ethan said quietly. "We'll get you back when the road's clear." Leo nodded, his eyes closing, as sleep pulled him back into warmth. Ethan sat silently for a long moment, watching the small boy breathe. The storm outside had left the world buried in silence again, but he felt something new stirring inside him, a sense that this meeting was no accident. Ranger moved closer and rested his head on Ethan's boot eyes, calm and watchful. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world carved in white silence. Snow covered every roof and branch like a heavy quilt, and the air hung still and clear. The morning light stretched pale across the frozen hills around North Haven. From the chimney of the Hale house, a thin curl of smoke rose faintly into the cold blue sky. Inside the house, Ethan Cole sat beside the fire, his hands motionless on his knees. The room was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the logs. Ranger lay nearby, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched from time to time, listening to the emptiness that filled the space once held by another voice. Margaret Hale had not woken that morning. Her passing came gently during the night without pain or sound. Ethan had found her still in her chair by the hearth, the same shawl around her shoulders, the same faint smile resting on her face, as if she had simply drifted into another dream. For a long time, he had stood there, unable to move, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and calm. The firelight touched her face, and in that light, she looked almost younger, the years softened away. He buried her the next afternoon on the small hill behind the house where the snow lay deep and unbroken. The ground was hard as stone, but he worked with slow determination until the soil gave way. The sky was gray, and the wind moved softly through the trees. Ranger sat beside the mound, his fur flecked with falling snow, his dark eyes following every movement of Ethan's hands. When it was done, Ethan placed one of Margaret's worn scarves over the grave and stood there for a long time, his breath white in the air. The silence pressed in like the weight of the snow itself. That evening, as the wind began to rise again, Ethan sat at the table staring into the flickering light of the lantern. The house felt larger now, colder and quieter. Ranger moved restlessly across the room, before stopping near the cabinet where Margaret had kept her letters and books. He barked once, a soft sound that made Ethan turn. On the top shelf rested a small envelope sealed with red wax. His name was written on it in careful shaky handwriting. Ethan took it down his fingers, trembling slightly. He broke the seal and unfolded the note. The writing was slow and uneven, but every word was clear. If the wind stops, open this. He looked around the room, confused. The wind was still moving outside, shaking the shutters. He folded the letter again and placed it back on the table. For now, it would wait. The days that followed were long and heavy. The villagers from North Haven came one by one, bringing food and quiet condolences. Many of them had known Margaret for decades, and their eyes carried the same grief that sat in Ethan's chest. Among them was a man named Howard Wells, the town's lawyer, a tall, thin man in his 60s, with gray hair slicked neatly back and eyes the color of smoke. His face was lined, but kind, and his voice had the calm tone of someone used to carrying other people's burdens. He arrived on the 7th day after the storm, carrying a leather briefcase under his arm. Ethan met him at the door, still wearing his worn brown coat, the sleeves stained from work. Howard removed his hat and nodded in solemn respect. "I came to speak with you about Mrs. Hale's affairs," he said quietly. "May I come in?" They sat by the table where the lantern burned low. Ranger rested at Ethan's feet, head on his paws. Howard opened the briefcase and withdrew a sealed document tied with a thin ribbon. "This," he said, "is the last will and testament of Margaret Hale. She prepared it nearly 5 years ago, but updated it last winter." Ethan frowned, uncertain. "She never told me anything about that." Howard nodded. She mentioned she would keep it private until the time came. He unfolded the papers, his voice steady as he read. To Ethan Cole, I leave my home and the adjoining land to be preserved under the Hale Land Trust, established in 1941. I do this in gratitude for his kindness, for restoring the beacon, and for keeping alive the light of compassion that once defined this place. Ethan sat in silence, unable to speak. The words felt heavy, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. The old woman had given him not just her house, but her legacy. He leaned back, his jaw, tight eyes fixed on the floor. I never asked for this, he murmured. Howard looked at him kindly. She knew that, which is why she chose you. By evening, word had spread through the town. Some came to offer congratulations, others came with questions. Among them were the workers from the King Development Site, men in thick coats, carrying themselves with the confidence of people backed by money. Their trucks, parked near the edge of the property engines, idling, as if marking territory. Two of them approached the porch where Ethan stood with Ranger at his side. The taller one spoke first, a man with a square jaw, a trimmed beard, and eyes that held neither warmth nor cruelty, just calculation. Name's Brooks, he said. I work for Mr. Charles King. He heard about the will. Mr. King sends his regrets about Mrs. Hale, but he needs to speak with you soon. Ethan's posture stiffened. About what? Brooks smiled slightly. About purchasing the property. He believes this land was part of the original King parcel, back before the trust was established. You can make things easier for yourself if you agree to talk. Ethan said nothing. Ranger stepped forward, a single low growl rumbling from his chest. Brooks looked down at the dog, then back at Ethan. No need for trouble, he said. We just deliver messages. When they left, Ethan watched the trucks disappear down the road, their red lights fading into the dusk. The snow began to fall again, fine and quiet like dust. He felt the chill creep into his bones, but deeper than that, he felt something else, a quiet resolve that surprised even him. That night, the wind outside calmed to stillness. For the first time in weeks, the trees did not sway, and the windows no longer shook. Ethan sat alone at the table, staring at the sealed letter Margaret had left him. The house was silent. The air inside was heavy, unmoving. The wind had stopped. He unfolded the letter and read. The words were few, but they seemed to reach through the years. If the wind stops, it means the beacon has been heard. What is given to you is not land, but duty. Guard it well, Ethan. The storms will come again, but so will the light. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the radio. Ranger rested his head on his knee, eyes half closed. Ethan looked toward the dark window, his reflection faint in the glass. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the calm outside was only the beginning of another storm, one that would not come from the sky, but from the world beyond these hills. The night had returned to North Haven, wrapped in soft blue shadows, and the calm that followed a long storm. Snow lay deep across the fields, and roofs glimmering faintly beneath the pale moonlight. The air was still cold enough to bite the skin, but the wind had quieted, leaving behind only the distant creak of trees under their frozen weight. Inside the Hale house, the fire burned steady and low, throwing a warm golden hue over the walls. Ethan Cole sat by the window, staring out at the dark outline of the radio tower behind the pines. Its metal frame caught the moonlight like a silver thread stitched through the black sky. He had not touched the transmitter in days, though it sat on the table, ready, the old dials and switches polished clean by his hands. The letter from Margaret rested beside it. Ranger lay close to the stove, head on his paws, his fur glowing in the firelight. His ears twitched when Ethan shifted in his chair. The dog had grown restless again, picking up the change in his master's thoughts. Ethan's mind was heavy with the weight of what he had inherited, not just a house, but a promise. The villagers had begun to talk. Some offered help, others whispered doubts. And now, word had reached him that Charles King, himself, was coming to town. King was a man known across the state, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to measure everything before him. He was in his early 60s, but carried himself with the energy of someone younger. His once black hair had turned silver at the temples, and a scar ran faintly across his chin, the result of a car accident years ago, a story he never liked to tell. Those who worked for him said he was decisive to the point of ruthlessness, a man who had built his empire by tearing down anything that stood in the way of progress. Yet there were rumors, too, that once long ago he had been a different man, one who believed in family and small towns before ambition swallowed him whole. When Ethan heard the sound of tires crunching over the snow that afternoon, he knew it was him. A black truck stopped at the gate, and Charles King stepped out, his long wool coat snapping in the wind. Behind him walked his son Daniel Leo's father, a quiet man in his late 30s, with the tired eyes of someone caught between loyalty and doubt. Daniel was lean, his face gentle but drawn, and his gloved hand rested on Leo's shoulder as they approached. The boy clung close to his father, his red scarf fluttering against the cold air. Ethan met them on the porch. Ranger stood at his side, watching silently. Charles King's gaze swept across the property, the old beams, the snow-covered yard, the faint shadow of the radio tower behind the pines. His voice was low but firm. "I came to discuss what's yours and what's still mine." Ethan motioned for him to come inside. They sat around the fire, while Leo stood near Ranger, one hand resting cautiously on the dog's neck. The boy had not forgotten the night of the storm, and Ranger's calm eyes seemed to reassure him that he was safe. King took off his gloves and stared at the flames for a long moment before speaking. "My lawyers tell me the Hale Land Trust was reinstated last week under your name." He looked up. That land was meant for development. It would bring jobs and money to this valley. Margaret Hale didn't understand that. She thought sentiment could feed people. Ethan met his gaze. "Maybe she understood better than you think. She built something that lasted longer than money." King's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair. "Father, maybe we should listen to what he has to say." King turned to him sharply, then softened his tone. "I've listened to enough dreamers in my life. Every time it ends, the same people holding on to ghosts instead of building something that matters." Ethan stood walking toward the transmitter. He placed his hand on the cold metal surface. "Margaret left something behind for this town. Not for me. For everyone." He opened the small tin box he had found weeks before and pulled out a worn tape reel. The label was faded but still legible: Snowhaven Beacon Winter Broadcast, 1972. King frowned. "What's that supposed to prove?" Ethan connected the reel to the transmitter, the old machine crackling as it warmed to life. Static filled the room, soft at first, then clearer. The lamp flickered, and through the speaker came the unmistakable voice of Margaret Hale, steady, kind, and filled with warmth. "If anyone hears this," she said, "remember that a town's heart is not in its buildings or roads, but in the hands that keep them standing. If someone tells you that the future means tearing down what was built with care, ask them if they ever kept anything beautiful safe." The room was silent. The words drifted out through the open door, carried on the cold air, spreading toward the sleeping town. Outside, the radio tower came alive, its light glowing faintly against the snowy darkness. Daniel's eyes softened, and even Leo stood straighter listening. "Father, she's right," he said quietly. "This place saved me. The people here, the man who helped me. You can't destroy that." Charles King did not answer. His face was still, but his eyes moved toward the window where the light from the tower pulsed slowly, a steady heartbeat of orange against the night. He stood, putting his gloves back on his expression, unreadable. When the broadcast ended, Ethan stepped away from the console. The static faded into silence. Across the valley, lights began to appear windows, glowing one by one as people tuned in to the old frequency. Then came the distant sound of footsteps and voices outside. The villagers were gathering, drawn by the message that had spread through the snow. Ethan opened the door. The air outside was crisp and filled with quiet murmurs. Men and women wrapped in heavy coats stood together, faces lit by lanterns. Some held hands. Others simply looked toward the radio tower that now shone bright against the dark horizon. The sound of the beacon had reached every home, just as it once had decades before. Among the crowd, Ethan saw Daniel with Leo beside him. The boy smiled shyly and waved. But Charles King stood apart, his tall figure outlined against the snow. His eyes were fixed on the tower, the reflection of its light caught in them like fire. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he turned slowly and walked back toward his car. Ethan watched him go. He did not call out. He knew that sometimes silence carried more truth than words. The villagers gathered closer, their faces glowing with quiet pride. Somewhere above them, the light from the beacon continued to shine unbroken in the falling snow. The morning light broke softly over Snowhaven, spreading a silver glow across the hills where snow still clung to every rooftop and pine branch. The air was cold and crisp, yet no longer bitter. The long winter had settled into calm, and from the top of the ridge, the sound of the old beacon tower hummed faintly through the stillness. Its light, once forgotten, now shone steady each dawn, guiding travelers and fishermen as it had decades ago. Ethan Cole stepped out from the restored Hale house, the familiar crunch of snow beneath his boots, grounding him in a peace he had not known for years. His brown coat, now worn but cared for, hung comfortably over his broad shoulders. His face carried the marks of both hardship and recovery. The faint lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, but they deepened now with quiet contentment rather than fatigue. His dark hair, streaked faintly with gray, caught the morning light. He lifted his gaze toward the tower, the beam cutting across the pale sky. Ranger padded beside him, the 6-year-old German shepherd, strong and alert. His fur was thick and golden black, his eyes sharp but calm. Around his neck hung a brass tag, etched with the words, "Chief of Safety." The dog paused, nose to the air, as if checking the morning wind for signs of change. Then he looked back toward Ethan Tail, sweeping the snow once in slow approval. The house behind them no longer stood in silence. It had become a living place once more. Children's laughter floated from the yard as the first group from the school arrived for the winter rescue lessons Ethan had started. Among them was Leo King, his red scarf bright against the white landscape. The boy had grown taller in those few months, his cheeks rosier, his voice more confident. He ran ahead to greet Ranger, throwing his arms around the dog's neck. Ethan smiled faintly, his breath misting in the air. He remembered the night he had found the boy, nearly frozen, and how that single act had changed everything. Behind Leo came his father, Daniel King, now a familiar face in Snowhaven. He had chosen to stay after the project collapsed, taking work at the community workshop that Ethan helped rebuild. Daniel's quiet nature fit well among the townsfolk. He was a man who spoke little but worked hard, his eyes often following his son with the tender watchfulness of someone given a second chance. Not far behind walked Charles King. The older man looked different now. The arrogance that once clung to his posture had softened. He wore a thick gray coat and a wool cap, his step slow but steady. His blue eyes still held the intensity of a man used to command, but now that fire was tempered by humility. Since the town meeting, he had withdrawn from his corporation's expansion plans, redirecting part of his fortune to fund the restoration of the Hale property and the Snowhaven Beacon. He said little about it, but Ethan knew it was his way of making peace. "Good morning," Mr. Cole Charles said, his voice low and roughened by age. "The repairs look fine from the road." Ethan nodded. "We keep it warm. People have started calling it the heart of the town again." Charles looked toward the tower, where the beam cut through a drift of falling snow. "That light was your doing," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "It was Margaret's. I just turned the switch back on." They stood together in silence for a moment, listening to the faint crackle of the radio waves from inside. The station had been reconnected to the regional network. Each morning, it broadcast weather alerts, community news, and the recorded stories of Snowhaven's older residents. Ethan had even recovered more of Margaret's tapes, restoring her old broadcasts so that her voice could once again fill the air over the valley. Inside the community room was warm and alive. The walls, once faded, had been painted cream and pine green. Photographs of the town's history lined the shelves, and jars of seeds collected from local farms rested beside an old microphone marked Snowhaven Beacon. A hand-carved sign above the doorway read Hale House and Beacon Center. On the far wall hung a framed picture of Margaret Hale holding a microphone, her smile full of quiet courage. Ethan moved through the room, checking the transmitter. The steady hum of power brought a sense of order to his morning. He adjusted the dials, his movements sure and calm. From outside came the sound of rangers' bark, deep and clear, signaling the start of the children's rescue drill. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. The dog had become something of a hero in the town. Children adored him, and adults trusted his instincts more than any machine. When the broadcast began, Ethan's voice carried across the snowy valley. "Good morning, Snowhaven. This is the Beacon. Temperature -5 and holding steady. Light snowfall expected through the afternoon. If you are heading to the lake, carry extra fuel and stay close to the marked trails. And remember, the brightest light is the one you keep lit for someone else." The villagers tuned in from their homes and shops, some smiling, others quietly listening. Even Charles King, sitting near the fire in the community hall, lifted his head as Ethan's voice came through the small radio on the table. Leo leaned against his grandfather's arm, the two of them silent as the message played. By noon, the snow thickened again, soft flakes drifting across the yard. The children finished their training and gathered around the heater where Ranger sat proudly wearing his brass collar. Ethan stepped outside with Daniel and Charles watching as the tower's light broke through the swirling white. The moment was quiet, almost sacred. Charles turned to Ethan. "You gave this place back its soul. he said simply. Ethan met his gaze. Maybe it was never gone. Maybe it was just waiting for someone to listen. The older man nodded slowly. His breath hung in the cold air. I used to think legacy was about what we build. Now, I think it's about what we protect. As the afternoon faded into dusk, lanterns lit up along the street leading to the main square. The whole town had gathered for the reopening ceremony of the Snow Haven Beacon. Ethan stood at the front steps beside Daniel, Leo, and Ranger. The villagers filled the yard, their faces flushed from the cold, their eyes reflecting the soft light of the tower. Ethan looked out over them, his heart full in a way he could not describe. For years he had drifted lost between past and future. But now, in this place, among these people, he had found something solid, a reason to stay. As the first chords of the town's old anthem played through the speakers, the light atop the beacon brightened. Snow began to fall heavier, the flakes catching the glow and scattering it into 1,000 tiny stars. Ranger barked once sharp and joyful, as if answering the sky itself. Ethan placed his hand on the dog's head. "We made it home, old friend." The crowd cheered softly, voices carried by the wind. The beacon light turned slowly across the valley, sweeping over the rooftops, the frozen lake, and the winding road that led north, the same road Ethan had once taken in search of nothing. Now it led to everything he had found. In that light, Snow Haven glowed alive again, and the man who had come with nothing but a truck, a coat, and a loyal dog stood in quiet peace, knowing that some lights once lit will never fade. As the snow settled softly over Snow Haven that night, the beacon's light continued to sweep gently across the valley, a reminder of everything that had changed. The town had found its rhythm again, not through wealth or progress, but through kindness, unity, and faith. People had learned that no storm lasts forever, and that even in the coldest winters, warmth can still be found in the hearts that care for one another. Ethan stood beside the tower, long after the crowd had gone home. He listened to the wind carry faint echoes of laughter and distant church bells from the valley below. Ranger leaned against his leg, eyes glowing softly in the beam of light above them. The man and his dog had come with nothing, but had given everything they had to protect a place that once seemed forgotten. Now that same place had become a symbol of hope for others. The beacon no longer belonged to one person, but to everyone who believed that faith and love could rebuild what was broken. And so, the light remained, unwavering, cutting through snow and silence alike. Ethan lifted his gaze to the night sky, where stars shimmered faintly through the drifting clouds. Sometimes miracles do not arrive in thunder or fire. Sometimes they come quietly in a kind word, in a stranger's hand, or in the steady flame that refuses to go out. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to be grateful for the blessings in your life. Share kindness wherever you can, for that is how God's miracles continue to move through us. Leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe so that more hearts can find warmth again. May the Lord bless you, keep you safe, and fill your days with the gentle light of hope